Toddler comforts crying German Shepherd. Her next move shocked everyone. If you think love is just a word, wait till you hear what this little girl did when she found him lying there, helpless, hopeless, and nearly gone. Her next move turned a tragedy into a miracle that people still talk about today. This story will move you. Like, share, and let us know where you're listening from. The morning carried that crisp bite only late autumn can bring, when the air feels thin and the light hangs pale over a quiet suburban street. Fallen leaves clung damply to the edges of the sidewalk, their colors faded but still holding on to traces of gold and crimson. In the small front yard of a cream-colored house, 3-year-old Mia sat cross-legged on the grass, her small plastic tea set arranged neatly before her. She poured invisible tea into cups no bigger than thimbles, humming softly to herself as the wind whispered through the bare branches above. Somewhere in the distance, the low hum of a lawnmower drifted through the air, blending with the rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. Mia adjusted the pink blanket she had draped over one of her toy guests, a stuffed rabbit whose ears flopped in the breeze, and lifted her cup in a polite toast to no one in particular. It was a morning like any other in her young life, safe, warm in its simplicity, untouched by anything beyond her little circle of imagination. But then, as she set the cup down, something changed. Her head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing toward the far corner of the yard. It was faint at first, so faint she might have dismissed it as the wind, low, uneven, like a breath caught between sobs. A whimper. Her brow furrowed, the sound pulling at something instinctive in her. She stood, brushing damp blades of grass from her knees, and took a step toward the wooden fence that bordered the yard. Again the sound came, soft but insistent, threading its way through the autumn air. It was coming from the alley beside the house. For a moment she hesitated. She knew the fence was where the yard ended and the unknown began. But curiosity was stronger than hesitation, and she moved forward with the tentative steps of someone not entirely sure if they were allowed to. The narrow gap between the fence and the hedge was barely wide enough for her to squeeze through. Dry leaves crackled under her boots as she shuffled closer, her mittened hands brushing against the weathered wood. When she finally peered through the gap, the world on the other side seemed a little dimmer, the pale sunlight not quite reaching the shadowed strip of alley. And there, against the base of the fence, was a large German shepherd. His head hung low, fur matted and streaked with dirt, his sides rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. His eyes glistened in the weak light, not with the sharp gleam of alertness, but with something softer, heavier. They were wet, and in them was the unmistakable shimmer of pain. His whole body trembled, not from the cold alone, but from something deeper. Mia didn't move for several seconds, simply staring. She had seen dogs before, but never like this, never so still, so fragile. Slowly, she lowered herself to her knees, her small frame barely reaching the dog's shoulder even from that position. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and high, shaped by innocence but carrying a note of assurance far older than her years. "It's okay," she whispered, the words forming puffs of steam in the cool air. "I'm here." The shepherd's ears twitched faintly, his gaze shifting toward her. For a moment, neither of them moved. The whimpering had stopped, replaced by the sound of his shallow breathing. Mia's mittened hand rested against the ground, just short of reaching him, her body leaning forward ever so slightly. The dog's head lifted a fraction, eyes searching hers as if weighing the truth of her words. Then Mia did something so simple it could be mistaken for nothing at all. But for this dog, it was everything. She reached out her tiny hand, the space between them narrowing until only air and possibility remained. And that's where the picture would freeze in the mind of anyone watching. Before we know if her fingers meet fur, before we know what happens next, holding the audience in that thin, electric pause where trust might just be born. Mia's world was small, but it was filled with love. She lived in a modest two-story house with cream siding and blue shutters, on a street where the sound of children's laughter in the evenings was as familiar as the scent of freshly cut grass in summer. Her parents, Claire and Daniel, doted on her without smothering, and her 6-year-old brother Ethan was both her greatest playmate and occasional rival. The neighborhood itself was quiet, a line of houses set back from the road, each with its own patch of lawn, its own set of trees that blazed with color in autumn and stood bare but dignified through winter. Mia had always had a way with animals. Though she was only 3, it was as if kindness toward them had been woven into her from the very beginning. Claire often told the story of how, at just 18 months old, Mia had toddled into the kitchen holding out a cracker to the family cat, Whiskers, who accepted it with regal disinterest. There was another time, last summer, when she'd crouched down on the sidewalk to gently pet the neighbor's golden retriever, murmuring something only the two of them seemed to understand. Her parents trusted her in the yard. It was fully fenced, with the gate latch high out of her reach, and from the kitchen window Claire could see the whole space, the patch of grass where Mia played, the low flower bed by the fence, and the old maple tree that threw shade across the corner in the warmer months. On most days, Claire or Daniel would glance out every few minutes, often smiling at the sight of their daughter deep in her imaginary worlds, making tea for her stuffed animals or arranging acorns like treasures in the dirt. But today, both parents were in the kitchen, moving busily around each other in the small space. Daniel was slicing bread for sandwiches while Claire stirred a pot of tomato soup on the stove. The air was filled with the smell of fresh basil and simmering tomatoes, the clink of utensils against bowls, and the occasional burst of laughter from Ethan in the living room as he played with his toy trucks. Neither noticed the exact moment when Mia left her tea party and wandered toward the narrow gap between fence and hedge. What she found on the other side was not something any of them could have prepared for. The German Shepherd was larger than she was, but in that moment he seemed smaller somehow, reduced, shrunken by whatever had happened to him. His fur, once thick and strong, was matted in places, clumped with dried mud and burrs. His paws were caked with dirt, the pads cracked, and a faint limp marked the way he shifted his weight even as he lay down. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were glassy, rimmed in red, and carried an expression that was hard to name. It wasn't just pain, though that was there in abundance. It was something more complex, something heavier. They were the eyes of someone who had been waiting too long for help, who had given up on it ever coming. Mia didn't know the word for what she saw, but she understood it in her own way. She stayed a small distance back, settling onto her knees in the dry leaves, the fence casting a broken shadow across her face. She didn't reach out again, not yet. Instead, she began to talk to him, her voice soft and rhythmic, the way she'd heard her mother speak to Ethan when he was upset. "It's okay," she said. "I've got a blanket. I can share." The shepherd's ears twitched slightly at the sound of her voice. His tail didn't move, but his eyes stayed fixed on her as though weighing her presence, trying to decide if it was safe. The wind rattled the hedge behind her, scattering a few loose leaves into the narrow space between them. She glanced back toward the house, then back to him, her expression one of careful patience. In that small gap between the fence and the hedge, time seemed to slow. The kitchen noises faded, the lawnmower in the distance became a dull hum, and there was only the child and the dog, watching each other across a space that felt far larger than it was. Neither knew it yet, but this quiet, cautious beginning would be the start of something that would change both of their lives. Mia sat there a little longer, speaking in short, gentle phrases to the German Shepherd, her voice carrying that peculiar calm only children seem to have when they decide something needs to be taken care of. But the chill in the air was creeping in, and she remembered the soft fleece blanket folded neatly on the couch inside, the one with faded cartoon stars that her mother used to wrap her in after bath time. Without a word, She stood up and darted across the yard, boots crunching over the brittle grass. The shepherd's head lifted a little, tracking her movement, but he didn't attempt to move. The back door creaked open and banged lightly against the wall as she slipped inside. Claire, still at the stove, glanced over her shoulder but didn't think much of it. Mia was forever running in to grab a toy or snack before returning outside. In the living room, Mia clambered onto the couch and pulled the blanket into her arms. It was almost too big for her to carry, and the edge dragged behind her like a train as she hurried back toward the door. She didn't stop to explain. The door clicked shut again, and she was back in the crisp air, the blanket trailing over the damp ground as she squeezed through the narrow gap toward the dog. She stopped just short of him and crouched low, the way she'd seen her mother do when tucking her in at night. Very slowly, she unfolded the blanket, the fleece catching slightly on the burrs in his fur. "It's okay," she murmured again, her voice so quiet it might have been meant only for him. She draped the fabric over his back, smoothing it down gently, careful not to press on any spots that might hurt. The shepherd's eyes half closed, and he released a sound that was almost a sigh, a deep, shaky exhale that seemed to carry weeks of exhaustion. His trembling didn't stop entirely, but it softened, as though the small weight of the blanket and the nearness of the child had pushed back some invisible edge he'd been standing on. Inside, Claire wiped her hands on a dish towel and glanced toward the living room. The couch was missing the blanket. She frowned. "Where's Mia?" she called toward the open kitchen doorway. Ethan mumbled something about playing tea party without looking up from his toys. But Claire had a prickling feeling and moved toward the back door. Through the glass, she spotted the narrow line of space between fence and hedge, just in time to see a flash of Mia's yellow boots. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she stepped quickly outside. "Mia?" she called, stepping onto the porch. "What are you?" Her words stopped midair as she caught sight of the large shape beyond the fence. For a moment her mind couldn't quite place it, just a huddled, fur-covered mass in the shadows, until the shepherd's head turned slightly toward her, eyes glinting in the pale light. Her breath caught. "Mia," she said again, her voice lower this time, "come here, honey." But Mia shook her head, keeping one hand on the blanket that now draped the dog's back. "He's cold," she said simply. Claire's first instinct was alarm, but it was quickly tempered by the sight before her. The dog wasn't growling. He wasn't showing his teeth. In fact, he was watching Mia with a strange stillness, as if trying to decide whether to believe her comfort. She stepped back inside for a moment and called for Daniel. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, eyebrows raised. "What is it?" "Just come look," Claire said, her voice tight. Daniel followed her outside, and the moment his eyes found the shepherd, his expression shifted. He took in the dog's posture, the limp way he held one paw slightly off the ground, the tremor in his body. He stepped forward cautiously, scanning for any signs of aggression. "Poor guy," Daniel murmured. "He's not just cold, he's in bad shape." Claire crossed her arms, worry etched into her features. "What do we do?" For a long moment, the three of them stood there, two adults trying to gauge the safest way forward, and one small child who had already decided that safety meant making the dog feel warm. Mia smoothed the blanket again, whispering something Daniel couldn't quite hear, and the shepherd's eyes followed her every movement. In that stillness, it became clear to both parents. This wasn't just a stray dog wandering through. This was an animal in deep distress, and somehow their 3-year-old had managed to be the one to reach him first. Daniel crouched low, extending his hand with deliberate slowness. The shepherd's gaze followed him, eyes wary but without the sharp edge of fear that might have turned to aggression. From behind her father's legs, Mia spoke softly, "It's okay, he's thirsty." Daniel set a shallow bowl of water down just within reach. The dog hesitated, nose twitching as he caught the scent. For a long moment, his body remained tense, the muscles in his shoulders shifting beneath the matted fur. Then, with a tentative movement, he leaned forward. His tongue touched the surface of the water, and once that first sip passed his lips, something seemed to break open inside him. He drank in small, desperate sips, pausing between each as if afraid the water might disappear before he could take more. Droplets clung to the fur around his muzzle, and his breathing was uneven, as though even the act of quenching his thirst cost him energy he didn't have to spare. As Daniel watched, he noticed something else. A frayed, weathered rope around the dog's neck, its fibers stiff with dirt. It wasn't a collar. It looked more like a makeshift tether, the kind someone might use to keep an animal tied to a post. The rope was worn through in one spot, as though it had been rubbed and pulled against for a long time before finally breaking free. Daniel's stomach tightened at the thought. "We need to get him inside," he said quietly over his shoulder. "Out of this wind." Claire glanced at the dog's size and shook her head. "He's heavy. You'll hurt your back." Daniel's eyes scanned the yard until they landed on the old laundry basket leaning against the side of the house. It was large enough for their folded bedding and sturdy. "I'll line it with towels," he said. "If we can coax him into it, we can carry him without jostling him too much." He disappeared inside for a moment, returning with a thick stack of clean towels. Mia stayed crouched near the shepherd, still speaking softly to him as Daniel laid the towels into the basket. Then Daniel knelt beside the dog, moving slowly, speaking in the same even tone he used when easing Ethan into the doctor's office for a shot. The shepherd didn't resist when Daniel slid an arm under his chest and another beneath his haunches. He was lighter than Daniel expected, alarmingly so for a dog of his size, but still heavy enough that the lift strained Daniel's muscles. The dog winced but made no sound, his head turning toward Mia as if to keep her in sight. Mia followed close as Daniel lowered him into the padded basket. The shepherd's body curled slightly to fit, and Mia was quick to pull the blanket back over him, tucking it around his sides. Then, without waiting for permission, she sat down on the grass beside the basket, her small hand resting gently on his back. "We'll go together," she said firmly, as if the decision was hers to make. The wind had begun to pick up, scattering leaves in restless circles across the yard. Clouds rolled in from the west, their edges already darkening. Claire wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. "Let's move before it gets worse," she urged. Daniel nodded, gripping the handles of the basket. Claire took one side, and together they lifted. The shepherd stayed still, only his eyes shifting to follow Mia, who walked right beside them, one hand keeping the blanket in place. Her little boots crunched against the gravel path, her gaze fixed forward as though leading a very important procession. By the time they reached the porch, the air had turned sharper, the kind that hinted at rain coming soon. The front door swung open, letting out a draft of warm air scented with tomato soup and fresh bread. Daniel stepped carefully inside, and Mia followed without hesitation, never once breaking contact with the dog. They set the basket down in the living room, near the low couch where Mia liked to nap in the afternoons. The soft lamplight filled the space with a golden glow, and for the first time since she'd seen him, the shepherd's shoulders seemed to ease. He was still trembling, but now it was gentler, like the aftershocks of a long storm. Claire knelt beside the basket, her voice low. "We'll figure this out," she promised, though whether she was speaking to the dog or herself wasn't entirely clear. Mia's hand stayed on his back, her small frame pressed close to the basket, as if she could will him to feel safe simply by being there. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and a single raindrop tapped against the glass. But in the living room, with the blanket warm against his fur and the soft hum of voices around him, the shepherd closed his eyes. For the first time in what might have been months, he was not alone. The living room was warm, but the shepherd couldn't seem to settle at first. Once Daniel and Claire stepped back to give him space, he rose unsteadily from the basket and began to pace, his paws making soft thuds against the carpet. His movements were uneven, the limp in his front leg more pronounced now that he was no longer lying still. Every few steps he paused, turning his head toward the window as if listening for something, then moving again, the tension in his body refusing to let go. Mia sat cross-legged on the floor, watching him with quiet interest, her hands folded in her lap. When he passed close enough for her to reach him, she didn't try to touch him right away. She only smiled and tilted her head. "Do you want some tea?" she asked, her tone bright, as if they'd known each other for years. Without waiting for an answer, she stood and crossed to the corner where her small plastic tea set still sat from the morning's play. She carried it back carefully, setting it down on the rug in front of her. The shepherd slowed his pacing, his eyes following her movements. When she lifted the teapot and tipped it over one of the tiny cups, he stepped closer, nose twitching. The clink of the plastic against the saucer made his ears flick. Mia giggled softly. "It's pretend tea," she explained, holding the cup toward him. "It's warm and nice." The shepherd leaned in, sniffing the cup, then the air around her hands. For the first time since they'd brought him in, there was something almost playful in his expression, a faint spark of curiosity breaking through the exhaustion in his eyes. He didn't drink, of course, but he stayed close, watching her pour tea into each cup and then pretend to sip. From the couch, Claire and Daniel exchanged a glance. It was impossible not to notice the way his focus stayed on Mia, the way his breathing seemed to slow when she was speaking. Claire's voice was quiet. It's like she calms him. Daniel nodded. Or maybe he's just been waiting for someone to be gentle. Mia didn't hear them. She was busy humming, a soft, tuneless sound that floated between her and the dog like a secret language. She placed one of the cups near his paw and gave it a gentle push. "Yours," she said. The shepherd didn't drink, but he lowered his head toward it, as though acknowledging the gift. Then, without warning, he shifted closer, lowering his large body onto the rug beside her. His movements were slow, cautious, as if testing whether she would move away. She didn't. When he was close enough, Mia reached out and touched the side of his neck, her fingers sinking into the rough, tangled fur. He let out a sound, a low, quiet groan that wasn't pain so much as release, the sound of a body finally allowed to rest. His head slid down into her lap, his weight warm and solid against her legs. Mia's small hands moved carefully through his fur, smoothing it the way she'd seen her mother smooth the bed covers. Her humming grew a little louder, her voice still calm. And then, without hesitation, she leaned forward and wrapped both arms around his neck. The embrace was clumsy in the way all toddler hugs are, more about holding on with all your strength and perfect form, but it was steady. She rested her cheek against his head, her eyes half closed. From where they stood, Claire and Daniel didn't speak. They knew instinctively that this moment was not to be interrupted. There was something in the shepherd's posture that made it feel sacred, a quiet surrender, a decision to trust. It was the first moment of real comfort he'd allowed himself in what was likely a very long time. And it was their 3-year-old daughter, not them, who had given it to him. The hum of a car pulling into the driveway broke the quiet. Through the window, Daniel saw the familiar green and white van of the local veterinary service. A moment later, the door swung open and Dr. Harris stepped inside, brushing the cold air from his jacket. He was a tall man with kind eyes, his medical bag hanging from one shoulder. "Where's our patient?" he asked gently. Mia pointed toward the rug without moving from her spot. "Here," she said, as if she were introducing an old friend. Dr. Harris knelt beside the shepherd, his hands practiced but soft as he examined the limp in his leg, the rough state of his fur. "You've had a rough go, haven't you, boy?" he murmured. Then, reaching into his bag, he pulled out a small handheld scanner. "Let's see if we can figure out who you belong to." The soft beep of the scanner passed over the back of the dog's neck. A second later, a faint chime sounded. Dr. Harris smiled. "He's chipped." He glanced at the small screen on the device, reading the information that appeared. "His name is Shadow." Mia's eyes lit up. "Shadow," she repeated, as if testing the sound. The shepherd's ears twitched at the name, and he lifted his head slightly, his gaze settling on the vet as though he understood every word. Dr. Harris stood, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "Address says his owner lives in the next town over. Elderly woman, Mrs. Evelyn Carter. She's been looking for him, reported him missing 2 months ago." Claire's hand went to her mouth. 2 months. The vet's voice lowered. "He's underweight, dehydrated, and the rope burn on his neck is older than the limp. My guess? Someone took him. Probably kept him tied up. And when they didn't want him anymore, they dumped him." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're saying he was stolen?" Dr. Harris nodded grimly. "It happens more than you'd think. Dogs like Shadow, strong, smart, purebred, are prime targets for illegal backyard breeding, sometimes worse. He's lucky someone found him." Before anyone could respond, headlights swept across the wall. Another car door closed, and moments later, there was a knock at the door. Claire opened it to reveal a small, stooped woman wrapped in a long wool coat. Her eyes were red-rimmed even before she spoke. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You found my Shadow?" Claire stepped aside, and the moment the woman entered, Shadow's head snapped up. It was as if some deep part of him had recognized her scent before his eyes confirmed what he was seeing. His tail gave a slow, tentative wag, then another, faster this time. He pushed himself to his feet, limping but determined, and crossed the small distance between them. Mrs. Carter dropped to her knees, her gloved hands cradling his face. "Oh, my sweet boy," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. Shadow pressed his muzzle into her shoulder, his tail now thumping hard against the rug. For a long moment, there was nothing in the room but the quiet sob of an old woman reunited with her dog and the deep, rumbling sigh of an animal finally home. When she pulled back, her smile was wet and shaky. "You've lost weight," she murmured, running her hands over his ribs. "And your fur, oh, what have they done to you?" Daniel and Claire exchanged a look with Dr. Harris, who stepped closer. "We suspect he was stolen, possibly for breeding or other purposes. The police should be involved." Mrs. Carter's face hardened in a way that suggested this news was not entirely surprising. "I always feared something like this," she said quietly, "but I never stopped looking." She kissed the top of Shadow's head and held him close again. From her spot on the rug, Mia had been listening to every word. Her small brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of it all. Finally, she crawled the short distance to where Shadow stood and wrapped her arms gently around his leg. Looking up at him, she said in the clear, confident voice only children seem to have, "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Shadow looked down at her, then leaned his head until it rested lightly against hers. It was the kind of gesture that didn't need translation. The weeks that followed brought a quiet sort of transformation. Shadow's limp grew less pronounced with each passing day, his fur regaining its luster as Mrs. Carter tended to him with patience and care. His ribs slowly disappeared beneath healthy weight, and the deep weariness in his eyes was replaced by something softer, warmer. Though he was back in his rightful home, Shadow became a frequent visitor. Mrs. Carter would appear at the gate with a smile, and Shadow, tail already wagging, would bound up the walkway as far as his recovering leg would allow. Mia was always there to meet him, her laughter spilling into the yard like sunlight. On this late autumn afternoon, the air was cool but gentle, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Leaves drifted down from the maples, each one spinning lazily before settling on the grass. In the middle of it all, Mia and Shadow moved together as if they had been doing this all their lives. She tossed a small red ball, and he trotted after it with an enthusiasm that made his tail a constant blur. Sometimes he didn't even bring it back, just dropped it at his own feet so she'd have to come to him, giggling the whole way. From the porch, Claire and Daniel watched the scene unfold. Claire leaned against the railing, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, and shook her head in quiet amazement. "You know," she said, "I don't think we'll ever really understand what made her go to him that day. But I'm glad she did." Daniel nodded, his eyes still on their daughter and the dog. "It's just who she is. She saw someone who needed her, and she didn't think twice." He paused. "We could all stand to be a little more like that." Out in the yard, Mia knelt in the grass, her small hands framing Shadow's face. He stayed perfectly still, his gaze steady on hers, as if there was some unspoken agreement between them that this moment was important. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, her cheek pressed into the warmth of his fur. A gust of wind stirred the branches overhead, sending a shower of golden leaves tumbling around them. From the porch, it looked like something out of a painting, child and dog, safe in each other's company, surrounded by the colors of a season that knew both change and beauty. For a long moment, no one spoke. And then Claire found herself saying aloud what she'd been thinking since that first afternoon. "That dog may have needed saving, but I think he saved something in her too." Shadow stayed for a while longer that day, basking in the attention, before Mrs. Carter called him home. But as he trotted back toward the gate, he glanced over his shoulder at Mia, his tail giving one last happy wag. The image lingered even after he was gone. The golden leaves, the quiet trust, the reminder that kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change everything. And as the story draws to its close, the invitation is simple. If you have a story like Shadow's, share it. Tell the world about the rescues, the reunions, and the moments of unexpected compassion. Support your local shelters. Because somewhere out there, another Shadow is waiting, and another Mia is ready to find them.